All right, we start with breaking news as we look at the United States Capitol lit up and beautiful now 2 hours ahead of the State of the Union address by President Biden. Welcome to the fairest show on television. First tonight from Washington. Actually, and we do mean that actually, that the stakes are very high. For the first time in recent memory, the State of the Union address matters. The stakes are high for a president with a lot to lose and really very little to gain, which is kind of weird when you look at the polling. You would think he has little to lose and lots to gain. We're going to get into why it is the reverse. President Biden speaks in less than 2 hours. We're covering his speech tonight from all angles. George will on whether President Biden can actually move the needle with his remarks. Plus, Congressman Dan Kildy on the real prospect that the president faces of hecklers from his own party. We start our coverage with Kelly Meyer at the White House ahead of the president's departure. Good evening, Kelly.
Hey there, Leland. Well, a lot of talk about freedom we're expecting tonight. Freedom to vote, freedom to choose. A lot of talk about reproductive rights as well as democracy. He's going to be talking a lot about what he calls the threat to democracy that his predecessor represents. There's also talk about his age. We received an excerpt from the White House tonight saying, quote, "My lifetime has taught me to embrace freedom and democracy. Now some other people my age see a different story, an American story of resentment, revenge, and retribution. That's not me," end quote. We also learned from a senior administration official that he is set to announce that the U.S. military will establish a port in Gaza along the coastline to move more humanitarian aid in. You might be able to hear the protesters right now outside of the White House who are calling for a ceasefire now. So you may hear more of that tonight as there is scrutiny around his support for Israel and the growing humanitarian loss there for innocent civilians in Gaza. We're also looking for him to talk about Ukraine funding, urging Republicans to pass that, as well as border security, though a White House official has told us that we are not expecting any kind of executive orders to happen in that speech tonight. There's no one referring to the border or no guests about the border or immigration in the First Lady's box tonight, but there are guests there that refer to or hope to get across the message of reproductive rights, with Katie Cox there, a guest of the First Lady. She's the woman that's suing Texas for having to go out of state to get an abortion, an emergency abortion that was recommended by her doctors. There's Sean Fain, the UAW president, as he received the endorsement. Biden received the endorsement from him, and he is going to be touting blue-collar jobs and trying to tout job creation. And then there's a Swedish prime minister, Sweden becoming welcoming into NATO today, something Trump has threatened to walk away from. So essentially a platform to deliver his message to the American people about why they should vote him in to serve another 4 years and keep this job in the Oval Office when Trump is saying to fire him. Leland?
Yeah, fair to say the timing on all this matters so much. This is the beginning of the general election for Joe Biden. I think you rightly point out, Kelly, the Gaza news was leaked early today about noon. Evidently, the protesters don't think it's enough. Kelly Meyer at the White House. Kelly, thank you. NewsNation senior political contributor George Will with us, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist as well. Good to see you as always, sir. Look, you want things that are low risk, high reward. This appears to be the opposite. I would flip that around, though, and to be fair. Republicans have set the bar for Joe Biden so low that if he can get up there and read the teleprompter for 50 minutes and not have some major meltdown, can't Democrats declare victory tomorrow?
I think they will. This is the first time since the invention of broadcasting and television that the story tonight will not be what he says, but if he can get through saying it, if he can indeed climb up to the lectern. Beyond that, he should have the Republicans in a bind on one issue, and it happens to be the biggest issue in the country right now, that's immigration. He can say with some truth that a bipartisan process produced an immigration reform bill that Donald Trump killed. Now, this was negotiated. The chief negotiator was the most conservative man in the Senate, Senator Langford of Oklahoma. Donald Trump pulled the plug on it, so the president can now say, what you people thought was going to be a big weakness for me is, in fact, on your shoulders.
Yeah, and we can imagine what the response from the Republican caucus would be when that happens. Look, he walks up, as you point out, walks into the chamber as a historically unpopular president at this time in his presidency. Clinton in 96 was at 52 points. W, 49 points. Obama in 2012, 49. Trump 2020. H.W. Bush in 92 was at 41 points. Biden in 38. The lesson here is that the two fellows who were at 42 and 41 lost re-election, and Biden is 3 points lower than that. How does he turn that around? Does it start tonight?
You'd better not count on that, because this State of the Union address is usually a hodgepodge, everything but the kitchen sink kind of speech. Last year, Leland, he had the attention of 27 million Americans watching him, and he said, I am going to do something about imports of drywall. That's not how you talk.
I think there was one time you and I were together when it was baggage fees.
Exactly.
Allegedly, or I shouldn't say allegedly, because we now have the excerpt and the embargo is lifted, he is going to address his age. There was another president who you were a big fan of who once addressed his age at the State of the Union address. Take a listen.
President Washington began this tradition in 1790 after reminding the nation that the destiny of self-government and the preservation of the sacred fire of liberty is finally staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people. For our friends in the press who place a high premium on accuracy, let me say, I did not actually hear George Washington say that.
And he was more than a decade younger than Joe Biden is.
My favorite part of that clip is George H.W. Bush, who clearly didn't know the joke was coming and was cleaning his glasses when it started. But why did making fun of his age work for Ronald Reagan and so far has not worked for Joe Biden?
Because Ronald Reagan radiated a kind of energy and vitality, the way he walked, the way he smiled, the way he addressed audiences. Joe Biden, to say no more, does not. Reagan's was a kind of punchline. Joe Biden's becoming a punchline.
Well, that's a hard thing once you become the joke. Just ask Sarah Palin, who could see Russia from her house. Once you become defined by the punchline, it becomes very difficult. You talked about the timing of this, if you can get through the whole speech. Since February 1st, President Biden's average amount of time speaking publicly has been 8 minutes and 4 seconds. So that's press conferences, speeches, gaggles, all of his events. The average has been about 8 minutes. Average length of the State of the Union since 2000, 1 hour, 6 minutes, 6 seconds. The longest, I think, was Bill Clinton, north of 90 minutes, and everybody wished that it could have ended. The shortest being about 40 minutes. How long does this speech have to be tonight for everyone to say, okay, he did it?
Ideally, it would be 30 minutes, but it can only be 30 minutes if the people in the audience, the two sides, cooperate. This has become a choreographed political rally in which the president's party's members in the Congress stand up on their hind legs and bray their approval, while the other party sit there with their arms folded across their chest, pouting theatrically. That takes time, it turns out.
It takes time for the director to know who.
Exactly.
Okay, there's Congressman so-and-so, there's Senator so-and-so. We're gonna check in and see what their facial expressions are. You have to wonder in the next 2 hours if those in Congress are practicing their facial expressions here.
Well, some of them are probably got there at noon today to get a seat on the aisle that the president will walk down so they can be seen touching the hem of his garment. It's pathetic.
You know what's funny, and I say this. You say that whether it's a Republican or a Democrat. I've listened to it both ways. Good to see you, sir. Thank you as always. Republicans will heckle President Biden tonight. We know this to be true. Marjorie Taylor Greene said as much. It appears as though she won't be the only one. But in shocking fashion, President Biden heads into the State of the Union facing the real threat of being heckled by members of his own party. Pro-Palestinian protesters have used their uncommitted movement to send a clear message to the White House. Sizable number of voters in several states have elected not to vote for Biden, voted for uncommitted. The White House tried to get out in front of this today, as you heard from Kelly Meyer, by leaking news of a new plan to get aid into Gaza by sending the U.S. military to build a harbor in Gaza. Congressman Dan Kildy, Democrat of Michigan, where there are more than 100,000 people who voted uncommitted. The congressman joins us from the Capitol ahead of the speech. Good to see you, sir. As always, thank you. We know that Iran has given Hamas anti-ship missiles that could be used against Americans if they were to steam through the Mediterranean and towards Gaza. You support putting U.S. sailors in harm's way to bring aid into Gaza?
I do, because I don't think we should punish the vast majority of Palestinian people who are suffering dramatically as a result of the actions of Hamas or Iran. That doesn't mean it doesn't present a threat, but on balance, we can't just simply stand aside and literally see thousands, maybe 10,000s of people die from starvation on top of those who've died from, the kinetic activity of the war. So I understand the risks, but I think the risks to the people of Palestine are really great, and we need to do something, and this is a step.
Fair to say that at least polling before the October 7th attack showed a large amount of support for Hamas within Gaza. Why do you think we are willing to use the U.S. military to bring aid into Gaza, but what message does it send that we're not using the U.S. military to rescue our hostages?
Well, first of all, that question is really left to Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government as to how to prosecute that aspect of the war. I have my own critiques of Mr. Netanyahu, even in terms of that, but I don't think the U.S. can necessarily insert itself into that particular question. The issue of humanitarian aid is a different question. It's not about the ballistic activity in the war. This is about feeding people so they don't die. And I think it's interesting, but I think a distinct question.
Okay, fair enough. People are dying from lots of different reasons, Hamas being the primary one. I want to get to parts of the speech. Do you worry, just from an optics standpoint, of hecklers up in the gallery, like we're seeing outside the White House, like we're seeing outside of the Capitol? Democrats, liberals, progressives going after President Biden tonight?
Well, I understand people feel passionate about this issue, and to be totally transparent, some of those votes in Michigan, 100,000 or so, I share some of the sentiment that they have. I'm critical of the Netanyahu government and even of our own policy in the U.S. when it comes to the prosecution of this war. However, at the State of the Union, whether it's a Democrat or Republican, left, right, or center, we ought to maintain some decorum, some respect for the institution. So whether it's somebody shouting from the floor or from the gallery, I don't think it's appropriate. I think the president has this opportunity to present to the American people his message. It's a message that I will largely agree with. There may be elements I disagree with, but I'm sure not going to stand up and try to interrupt that speech. And I don't think anybody else should either.
Fair enough. You note that you have some difficulties with the way the president has been prosecuting this war. How difficult is it for the president tonight, who is launching his general election campaign? That's the power of the presidency, is you get to do it at the State of the Union. How difficult is it for him, who can't tack to the center? He can't tack to the center with an executive order on the border. He can't tack to the center with more support for Israel. He's got to send U.S. troops to build a harbor in Gaza. Can't tack to the center on student loans. He has to highlight student loan forgiveness. It's unpopular with working class Americans. He's penned in, isn't he?
Well, whenever you're the president of the United States, only the hard decisions land on your desk. The easy ones get taken care of long before they get to you. So no matter what the issue is, and no matter who the president is, that's essentially the case. It's a tough job. And this job, presenting an agenda to the American people with the dynamic that you just mentioned, is difficult. I'm confident that he'll be able to do it. Everyone may not agree with what he has to say, but I'm confident that he'll be able to deliver that message.
I'll ask the same question I asked to George, to you, sir. How worried are you about a moment that everyone has to acknowledge shows what we've all been thinking and what the polling shows about President Biden's age?
Well, I don't know that we've all been thinking it, because I spend a lot of time with the president, and I think he's sharp. I think there's a bit of a double standard when it comes to the president and the former president. They both have moments that are subject to criticism. I think he'll do fine. I agree a lot with George Will on some of these subjects. He's always right about baseball. He's actually right when it comes to this issue of immigration and border security. But I think I may disagree with him on that point.
Fair enough. At least we can have a little bit of bipartisan agreement here on the show, if not in the Capitol tonight. Congressman, it's always good to see you. A pleasure, sir. Thank you.
Thanks, Leland. Good to see you.
All right. Yeah, you as well, sir. Still ahead, a horrific admission about the controlled burn following a train crash in East Palestine, Ohio.
They informed them that they believed polymerization was not occurring and there was no justification to do a vent and burn.
They didn't have to do it. There was another way. It could have been safer. One resident from East Palestine tells us why they still feel forgotten, even more so now. Plus, live pictures of the Capitol. New reporting shows President Biden's get tough on China strategy isn't working. How Chinese-built cargo cranes will serve as a Trojan horse for their military. What President Biden says about the military when we come back.
In the midst of a terrible tragedy on the Potomac, we saw again the spirit of American heroism at its finest. We saw the heroism of one of our young government employees, Lenny Skutnik, who, when he saw a woman lose her grip on the helicopter line, dived into the water and dragged her to safety.
President Ronald Reagan, at his 1982 State of the Union speech honoring hero Larry Stutnick, government employee who just 2 weeks before Reagan's speech jumped into the icy cold Potomac water to save a female passenger struggling to hold onto a life buoy. You can see the video there. She was on Air Florida Flight 90 that crashed into the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. That day, she was one of the few that survived, thanks to Lenny Stutnick. Reagan started the tradition of presidents bringing guests to highlight important issues. Despite his visit a few weeks ago, President Biden didn't invite a single resident of East Palestine, Ohio. We learned yesterday that massive chemical burn that polluted the entire town, the flames shooting up into the sky, well, that didn't need to happen.
They informed them that they believed polymerization was not occurring and there was no justification to do a vent and burn. There was another option. Let it cool down.
There was another option, and yet they still burned everything. East Palestine resident Dr. Rick Sy is with us. All right, does this surprise you? I know it makes you angry.
It doesn't surprise me at all. Before I speak about it, rickchai.com, RICKTSAI.com, because I want justice for East Palestine, but not just justice, but when I win in Congress D6 of Ohio, there's going to be a reckoning. So I studied intensively those 18 hours of NTSB hearings in the summer. They were talking with Unified Command, your new Norfolk Southern's person that was in charge of relaying messages to Unified Command was talking to oxyvinyls, and the temperature was actually higher the day before, and it didn't blow. The temperature was about 120 degrees when they blew them. Oxyvinyl said there was no chance of polymerization. That means the monomers, the vinyl chloride monomers, single molecules, they were afraid they were going to start sticking together and form PVC and muck up the release valves, and the pressure would build and the tankers would blow up.
Forgive me, I get there's a lot of technical parts to this, but if we sort of zoom out and keep this on a little bit higher level, who's at fault here? Is it Norfolk Southern? Is it the NTSB? Who's at fault?
So Norfolk Southern's person did not tell Unified Command that oxyvinyl said that there was no chance of those mucking up the valves and blowing up. So I believe, and then when why
do you think, who's responsible for so far, and I know folks in Eastern Ohio feel this way, that Norfolk Southern hasn't been held fully responsible? More importantly, who's responsible for the fact that the Rail Safety Act that would protect towns like East Palestine hasn't been passed?
Listen, there's so much corruption in government. I do not know how far the tentacles of corporations go into government and who gets paid off, but I'm going to find out. The Rail Safety Act should have been signed, and Norfolk Southern, not only did they blow those trains up when doing it correctly would have taken 5 days, they knew by blowing them up, they would have got them out of there in a day, and they can roll their trains right through the contaminated liquid and soil, which they put their tracks right over. It was an insult to the people of East Palestine, Ohio, and we were collateral damage. In the break, you said, I'm going to go back to see if I feel like we are forgotten. We're not forgotten. The president knows we're here. We're abandoned. He just doesn't care about us. When he came in, He didn't give us anything, not a penny, not a bottle of water. He said, study these people. I'm giving 5 grants to study these people for long-term health effects. If you do not get the poison out of our hometown, you get the people away from the poison. And Norfolk Southern is responsible, and the Ohio EPA has been lying. They're just as complicit as Norfolk Southern.
Wow. All right. I'm guessing you don't have much faith that the president's going to mention East Palestine tonight.
No, and if he did, it was disingenuous. He came in and met with a few hand-picked Democrats. He was here for about 35 minutes and blew out of town.
Got it.
It was a disgusting display of just wearing our town like cheap bling around his neck.
Well, the good news is if you end up being in Congress, we won't have to wonder how you really think about things. You seem to be, at least so
Not if,
far.
But when, my friend. When I end up in Congress, you ask me a question, I won't spin it.
All right. Fair enough. Well, that'll make you a frequent guest on television. It's good to see you. Thank you. We appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. And I'm at a Lincoln Day dinner. Sorry for the backdrop.
No,
I'm about to speak at a Lincoln Day dinner.
Enjoy it. We appreciate it. We'll head now back here to Washington at the Capitol. Big question of how much the State of the Union is going to be a call to arms. We know President Biden will talk about Israel. He will talk about Ukraine. He will talk about the threats facing America. The Swedish Prime Minister, who just joined NATO, will be in the audience. FDR did it in 1941 in the months ahead of Pearl Harbor.
Freedom means the supremacy of human rights everywhere. Our support goes to those who struggle to gain those rights and keep them. Our strength is our unity of purpose to that high concept. There can be no end save victory.
A big challenge for President Biden tonight is convincing Americans to take foreign policy seriously. Just today, we got another huge wake-up call. An espionage probe found that communications devices on Chinese-made cargo cranes at U.S. ports might be reporting back to China. Dmitry Alperovich is here, former special advisor to the Department of Defense. Also out with a new book in May, World on the Brink, How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century. It's good to see you, Dmitry. Thank you. Normally have you here to talk about Russia and Ukraine, now China. Obviously, the fear with these cranes, right, is that somehow China can control them. They can have them run into each other. There's a conflict in Taiwan. They destroy our parts, on and on and on. If there are hidden Trojan horses and cargo cranes at our major ports made by the Chinese, where else are they?
Well, these cranes are manufactured first and foremost by state-owned Chinese companies. So obviously, China has enormous control over its private sector. It doesn't need to have that level of control with this company because it literally owns it completely. And it manufactures over 75% of these container cranes that are used in ports all over the world, not just the United States. So it's a huge concern. I've actually been working on this issue for a couple of years.
So hold on, just to stop you. You say it's a huge concern. Why?
Well, a couple of things. One, there have been communication devices, as you said, that have been found on these cranes. They can be remotely controlled. First of all, for intelligence collection purposes, you can use it to figure out what is going on a port. And then you might have the ability to actually destroy that infrastructure and prevent logistics, for example, from flowing into the Indo-Pacific if there's some sort of conflict with China.
All right. So if they've done it to cranes, what else have they done it to?
Well, of course, there's huge concerns around a number of these huge companies, either private companies or state-owned enterprises in China. Huawei is one that we've been talking about for 15 years. Their telecommunications equipment is in most telecommunications infrastructure around the world, not in America, thankfully. There's some in America in regional players, but not in major carriers. But that gives them another leverage point in terms of ability to wiretap communications, but also to destroy them in the case of conflict. And, of course, our modern societies are running off communications.
Look, you also think about the Chinese ability and the warning from the FBI to hack into our domestic infrastructure. TikTok is another one people have been talking about. You, among others, who are very smart, who have deep knowledge of what the Chinese are able to do, have literally been shouting from the rooftops for 15 years about this, from everything from Huawei to the guys DJI who makes drones to the cranes to to critical infrastructure, on and on and on and on. And yet nobody seems to care or listen or change. Why is that?
Well, I think things are changing. You look at this bill that Congressman Gallagher has introduced in the House of Representatives to try to ban TikTok from American phones. That's progress. U.S. government is looking to replace all of these ZPMC cranes that we have in this country to prevent China from having this control. We're pushing back on Huawei. Obviously, we prevented them from having infrastructure, mostly here domestically. We're trying to get our allies to do the same. So we're finally waking up to the threat. We're trying to act, but we're behind. I don't know that we are too late. We have some years, I think, before China would be ready to move on Taiwan, but we have to up our game, and we have to move much quicker.
All right, Dmitry, thank you very much, as always. You've proven prophetic, whether it be about the invasion of Ukraine and now about China as well. So your commentary and thoughts are worth listening to. Thank you.
Thank you.
2.8 million Nikki Haley primary voters are now up for grabs. They will likely decide the election, and tonight Joe Biden makes his case to them. Former Governor Mike Huckabee on Republicans' challenges tonight.
To give the American people a smaller, less bureaucratic government in Washington. And we have to give the American people one that lives within its means. The era of big government is over.
If only we had a government the size of government in 1996, right? That's Bill Clinton, after his party got shellacked in the 94 midterm using Republican talking points to appeal to swing voters. He would go on to a landslide victory for re-election. Reasonable people can agree. Whoever wins the presidency coming up, it is going to be decided by Nikki Haley voters, the swing voters. Mark Thiessen writes in the Washington Post, Trump needs Nikki Haley voters to win the White House back. Biden's campaign had put out a statement, you might remember. Donald Trump made it clear he doesn't want Nikki Haley supporters. I want to be clear, there's a place for them in my campaign. Mike Huckabee is here, former Arkansas governor, former presidential candidate. Good to see you. Should Republicans be worried that Joe Biden uses tonight to pivot?
I don't think so, because I don't think he will pivot. There's three big things Joe Biden's facing in his State of the Union. First is competence, both mental and physical. Can he go the distance in this speech? Does he appear to have command of things? That's the first thing. The second is credibility. If he goes out there and tells everybody how wonderful the economy is, how great his administration has handled everything, I think he blows his credibility because families are looking across the table at each other saying, it ain't so good for us. And I think he destroys what credibility he may want to have. And the third, culpability. Leland, there's nothing wrong with the political figure just being honest and saying, we didn't do everything right. We did some things wrong. It was one of the things Bill Clinton was great at. He could come across with that sense of empathy. If Joe Biden doesn't own up to the mess at the border and to some of the mistakes of the economy, then I think he does not deliver a decent State of the Union, and his numbers continue to do what they're doing, and that's spiraling to the drain, somewhat like the shower scene in Psycho from Alfred Hitchcock's movie in 1960.
Okay, we're going way back in that case. A couple of thoughts, thoughtful answer here. Can't get much lower than 38% where he's at right now. It doesn't appear as though he has a lot to lose so long as he can get through the speech. Nikki Haley won 2.8 million votes in the GOP primaries this year. Trump lost in 2020, by 42,000 votes, and he won in 2016 by about 100,000 votes. You put that together, the Nikki Haley's voters matter. If Joe Biden leaves them up for grabs, what does Donald Trump do to convince them to actually come to the polls in November?
Well, Joe Biden was dishonest when he said that Donald Trump didn't want the voters. Donald Trump didn't say that. That's Joe Biden's spin, and it's not true. Of course, Donald Trump wants the voters. Now, let's be fair. Some of those voters for Nikki Haley were Democrat crossovers who just wanted to kind of mess up the election and poke Donald Trump. So some of those folks were never going to vote for Nikki Haley.
To be fair,
yeah, but they were never going to vote for Nikki Haley in the general.
Yeah, no, I mean, some of them were. Some of them were. I was in Iowa and South Carolina and New Hampshire with a lot of them. Those, just look, anecdotally, those were few and far between. There were a lot of Republicans who said, I voted Republican. I just don't like Donald Trump. He needs those people, doesn't he?
Of course he does. And there are Republicans who don't like Donald Trump. The question is, are they seriously going to vote for Joe Biden? Mr. I messed up the border, screwed up the economy, has a radical view of everything from gender to the sanctity of life. If people who claim to be Republican vote for Joe Biden, honestly, they're not Republican, because there's not a thing Joe Biden stands for. Here's what they're voting on. They're voting on personality, not principle. People who are principle Republicans are going to come home. They don't have anywhere else to go. They may not like Donald Trump. They may hold their nose and vote for him. But if they are principled conservatives, Republicans, pro-life, pro-America, they're not going to vote for Joe Biden. They just can't.
All right. Tonight, obviously, there's the State of the Union. Then there is traditionally the Republican response. Your daughter, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, last year did it, acquitted herself very well, which is why one of the very many reasons she's on the short list, as we have heard, for vice president. Don't worry, I won't ask you about that. But Katie Britt is giving the response tonight for the Republicans. When you talked to your daughter after the speech last year, what lessons learned do you think would be helpful for Katie Britt, for Republicans at all tonight, to make a difference with a response that typically is always an asterisk in history?
First of all, Katie's going to do great. She's so articulate and intelligent, and she's just the right person for this, and I'm thrilled that they chose her. But I think the advice would be, not that she's asked me, but if she did, I would say, be yourself, first and foremost, and secondly, don't spend a lot of time talking so much about Joe Biden specifically. Talk about this country and why it does matter who gets elected and who governs, not just at the White House, but the Senate and House. And I think Katie can do that and will do that very, very effectively. And I think her energy and her youth will also be an extraordinary contrast to what I'm looking for in Joe Biden, which frankly is not a real high bar. I think a lot of people are just wondering, can he get through it without mumbling, stumbling, and bumbling? That's going to be the challenge for Joe.
I'll give you the last 30 seconds. Is there a danger for Republicans to set the bar that low?
They could. I mean, Joe may take enough B12 to just be on the top of his game tonight, but it still doesn't change the policies that Americans are frustrated with. Right. They're not just frustrated that he stumbles up the stairs. They're frustrated that their country is stumbling and they're hurting economically. That's what they're looking for.
Yeah, from Katie Britt, just got her remarks. The true unvarnished state of our union begins and ends with this. Our families are hurting. Our country can do better. To your point, exactly. Governor, it's always good to see you. Thanks for the time, sir.
You bet. Thank you, Leland.
Thank you. President Biden, well, he got some help with his speech tonight. You'll see for yourself, he reached for the stars.
Well, sir, in my capacity as president, all I had to deal with was a meteor.
All right, from Morgan Freeman to Gina Davis, the advice movie presidents had.
I know from experience, obviously, what a tough job it is. And, when I was president, it seemed like every week there was some new crisis that I had to face.
You did a hell of a job.
Some people question their government's ability to make hard decisions and stick with them. They expect Washington politics as usual.
A lesson for Joe Biden. Gerald Ford told the truth in 1975, and he lost. That State of the Union became memorable for all, you might say, the wrong reasons, or the right ones because of how direct Ford was. President Biden and the White House are hoping for a different outcome tonight. This is the launch of his general election campaign. And to prepare, the president leaned on an interesting cast of characters for inspiration, meaning people who have played, quite literally, the president.
I never spoke to so many presidents all at one time. Some of you might know what a big speech like I have to do is coming up State of the Union. Any advice you have for me in delivering my speech?
All right, so Martin Sheen from the American President and others. Director of Data Science at Decision Desk HQ, Scott Tranter, who has finally gotten some sleep after Super Tuesday, Associate Research Scholar at Princeton University, Lauren Wright. Welcome to both of you. It's interesting sort of the way the State of the Union goes, because it's like you mention all these phrases, right? You hit all these different interest groups. Betting odds on Biden phrases, Scott: Israel minus 1,500, border minus 200, Chinese proverb plus 5,000. What is he going to do? Quote Sun Tzu. Or I offer my resignation plus 8,000. Nikki Haley's in there as well. Would you take any of these bets?
I mean, you always got to take the plus 5,000 bet, but I don't even think that one's going to happen. Certainly going to mention, I read the pre-write like you did, certainly going to mention the border, certainly going to mention Gaza. So I guess it's all out of the bag.
All right. Lauren, to this point, we've said this all along. Very, very low reward, high risk for President Biden tonight. The stakes are actually high for the State of the Union. But so long as he gets through it, and Mike Huckabee, among others, have set the bar really low, like so long as he doesn't stumble over every sentence.
I agree.
Isn't it a win?
Yes, it is. The bar is so low, and so every surrogate is out talking about, you're going to see this energized president, he's going to make it through the thing, he's going to be so passionate, and that is the bar. And so the bar is not the policies and the quality of the argument. The bar is, can he stand up there and look coherent? And I actually think, to Scott's point, Gaza and the border are the two most difficult issues for him, because those are the issues where Democrats are absolutely tearing themselves apart between the progressive wing of the party that, is anti-Israel and pro-open borders, and the moderates who are more old school and have a lot of the views that Biden himself does.
Yeah, we had Dan Kildy on earlier who spoke to that, right, about how penned in Joe Biden is, because normally this would be the moment that he's going to pivot to the center, right? This is the general election. You pivot to the center. You do what Bill Clinton did in '96. This is Steve Kornacki, and I thought this was a fascinating point that he brought up last night. He brought this point up last night. Siena College, New York Times poll: 97% of 2020 Trump voters say they're sticking with Trump. 85% say they're sticking with Biden. How big of a problem is that, Scott?
That is a huge problem when we're talking about an election that, if it were held today, would probably be decided by 1 or 2 points, or tens of thousands of votes in 3 or 4 states. Those numbers mean something. And let me just add something else. Look, the number one issue in the NewsNation poll has been the economy and immigration. So he's going to talk about that. The number one issue for his base, or his core of his base, is Gaza. And so he's going to talk about two things, basically to shore up his base and try and go after that middle. The data says it all. It's going to be an interesting needle to thread, and we'll see if some of these numbers go up.
Yeah, we've heard the protesters outside that a makeshift harbor, even if the U.S. military goes in there, isn't enough for them. If the U.S. military sustains losses, it's another Afghanistan and Kabul withdraw and even more problems. But, Lauren, to this point, you've got this issue, and there's now been a euphemism, I think, that's entered into our lexicon of freedom. And that comes under personal freedom, and I guess then it extends to reproductive freedom, which we know that the president's going to talk about a lot. Can Democrats continue to rebrand the abortion issue into personal freedom?
Yes. I mean, this is their best issue. They only have 2 issues to run on. One is Donald Trump and how terrible he is, and one is abortion. And those are the issues that are the cases they can make. They happen to not be the issues that are the very top of the list, but they were successful in 2022. And look, I think the Republican Party is absolutely going to coalesce around Trump. We forget in 2016, there was talk of a contested convention. Ted Cruz got almost 600 delegates. Marco Rubio and John Kasich had almost a couple hundred. This is going to be much easier.
Every cable TV anchor's and analyst's dream is the idea of a contested convention.
Yeah.
It's going to be, hasn't happened actually since Gerald Ford, right? That was that. All right, Scott, just purely from a polling standpoint, what would change the dynamic tonight?
If he came out with a vigorous, bombastic, and engaging speech, because that is the number one issue for independent voters, Democratic voters, and any of the Republican voters that he's coming out, is his ability to serve another term. It's not something we like to talk about, but that is what it is. So if he comes out and wows some people, he's gonna have a captive audience. He's got an opportunity there, and like we talked about earlier, his numbers only can go up.
All right, he's got a captive audience. I get it, and also, look, the stakes are high. The stakes were high. You think about when he gave the speech a week or 2 after the Ukraine invasion. It was one of his best speeches. I think people universally could have agreed. I was there anchoring that night, and people went, "Wow, this was a great speech." A month later, his poll numbers were exactly the same. Lauren, last year, 27.3 million people watched the State of the Union. That's 1/5 the ratings of the Super Bowl.
Exactly, and about the same as the Game of Thrones finale, to put it into context.
Who's watching that? Are they independent voters, or are they just political junkies like the rest of us?
I mean, there are probably a lot of political junkies, but the average American primetime will tune in to any station and see the President of the United States making an address. It is substantively important. The best thing that could happen to him is if House Republicans act very badly and very childishly. That would be great for Biden.
Well, never underestimate Republicans' ability to screw things up. We've said that before.
Yeah.
All right. Your thoughts on the State of the Union and what must be heard tonight as we check in on the Capitol 1 hour before President Biden heads up Pennsylvania Avenue.
Boy, do I hate being right all the time.
And there's a chance dinosaurs could return as well. Something to think about. Not sure how the preview being approved for all audiences. Well, you never know. We'll see you in a minute. All right, live pictures down Pennsylvania Avenue. President Biden is just about to leave the White House as he heads to the Capitol. Pretty incredible thing is happening right now throughout Washington. There are mass protests going on, both outside the Washington Monument and outside the White House.